I thought were important here. So I was looking through some data, and according to the National Institute of Standards and Technology, manufacturing is responsible for about 12% of our GDP. Every dollar spent in manufacturing generates about $1.48 in economic productivity in other sectors of the economy. So we've got a powerful multiplier out of investments in manufacturing. The growth in manufacturing is very important to the economy, but if manufacturers can't get adequate funding, then growth is obviously held back, and that means that they can't take on more orders, hire more people, make more shipments, that sort of thing. Now, a recent study from NIST, which analyzed the results of a national survey from manufacturing companies, found that a lack of access to capital was one of the main obstacles to manufacturers' ability to remain profitable, to expand their operations, and to compete with larger companies. Can't get the money, can't make the investments, can't have a business that prospers and then grows. So the question I'd like to ask, and I'll ask it to anyone on the panel, is how do we think about sustaining, expanding capital, making capital available to manufacturers, particularly to smaller manufacturers? Does anyone have thoughts on this or has had any experience with this? Mr. Dietz, you had the misfortune of moving first. So,
I represent the National Association of Home Builders. I would say that's beyond just manufacturing; it's construction as well.
Fair enough.
Absolutely, a very large issue for home builders. Something like 2/3 of the construction in this country is done by small firms that are family-owned, that have 10 or fewer employees, and that access to credit, what's called acquisition, development, and construction loans, is a big deal. And a lot of that lending comes through smaller banks. So we need to make sure that the community banking system is available so you get the kind of benefits that come from regional growth. And it's also, we've talked a lot about demand. It's also a matter of credit for home buyers. And so, people go through a life cycle, they rent, they buy, but credit is key to turning that kind of macroeconomic concept of demand into a kind of a real economic benefit at the microeconomic level.
Yeah, it's a very powerful point you make about the importance of community banks, that community banks disproportionately relative to big banks spend more of their lending portfolio in small business lending. And I worry about our community banks because we all know the number of community banks out there is shrinking. They're under a lot of pressure. They're under regulatory pressure. They're under other economic pressures. They get swept up in purchases by other larger financial institutions. And every time that happens, it's not only an impact on that community bank and on the banking system, it's also an impact on every small business that counted on that community bank for its financing. Anybody else want to speak to this? Any other thoughts about it? Yes, sir.
Well, from the machinist perspective, this is an interesting conversation, and we're talking from our own parochial points of view, but what the government needs to do is start thinking big again. First thing to the safety of community banks and support is to reinstate Glass-Steagall, handle a few matters.
I did not set you up with that answer.
No, but you certainly
clarify?
gave me the opportunity to put my 2 cents
Good.
worth in. But Senator Merkley, you pointed out, as did others on the panel, the crisis in, for instance, water resources in this country. Being an old union, 126 years old this past Monday, we were around at the creation of the Tennessee Valley Authority. And we were designated by President Roosevelt, to the machinists and the electrical workers, to build TVA. And if you take that concept and expand that nationwide, you address the issues of water resources. With that inherently are the other side, sewer, waste, but it also has an element of power with it where we generate low-cost electricity. that in turn, when power is cheap, to entice manufacturing to start. And the consumers of that on both ends, the manufacturing side, the using end, and those then who will benefit from it on the purchasing side, seems to be a self-perpetuating idea. And that's something that merits deep thought and a review. I mean, all the lessons of the past were not bad lessons. TVA happens to be, I think, one of that and Social Security, the two great hallmarks of Franklin Roosevelt's domestic agenda. Instead, today we fight because the government wants to privatize TVA, much as we did the banking community. In our experience as a union with the deregulation, privatization of transportation, of power, of pharmaceuticals, of banks, of just about everything in our lives has been the code word for destroy. Why do we want to do this? So I would recommend the creation on a big thinking level of a development bank, a bank that spurs innovation, low-cost loans to those who wish to get into the manufacturing business, that we give it oversight to assure it does provide jobs, the middle-class jobs we're looking for, to sustain this country. And if we've got the stomach for big-ticket items again and a challenge to America, I think this country's looking for that kind of challenge again.
I really appreciate your making that point, Mr. Buffenbarger, because you are exactly right, that when we make the investments in infrastructure, we not only create good jobs right now, we create the right conditions for businesses to be able to grow and flourish. Every investment that we make in the power grid is an investment in bringing down the cost of production for every business out there. You are right. Every investment we make in roads and bridges is an investment in being able to get your goods to market. And when we make those investments, we have an opportunity to build a future in manufacturing and a future in all other business areas. It's a very good point. Anyone else want to add, Mr. Smith?
Yeah, Senator, I would like to add a point to your great point about community banks and credit unions, actually, and how close they are to their communities, and a point related to the work I'm in, which is energy efficiency retrofits of homes. And before I do that, I just want to credit Senator Merkley for your, I meant to mention in my previous statement, your efforts to get capital to rural communities through working with rural utilities, which is a huge help for those communities. What we have experienced is we took U.S. Department of Energy stimulus dollars to provide credit enhancements early in the stimulus, or early in the downturn of the economy, to motivate private lenders to lend into the residential energy efficiency sector. In 2008, there was no lending anywhere, but certainly not in this new burgeoning field. And what we have been able to do in the past few years is actually unlock that private capital, pull the credit enhancements, and have multiple lenders competing for this sector because we created competition among them. And we have found that it has been community banks like Umpqua Bank and credit unions like Advantis and Selco and others in our state that are closer to the ground. They're closer to the communities. They want to support their members. They want their capital to go locally. And I find a little editorial here, a little too much attention on the big banks and interest from those banks in reaching out their hand for subsidy, when actually it's these small banks that are taking the risk. There is enough data in this sector that it's worthy of investment, and I believe that if we turn our attention to supporting these community banks, as you pointed out, that the big banks will follow at some later point as demand. Again, we need more demand before they're going to enter the market. We don't need to subsidize them. We need to focus on the small guys who are close to the communities. Thank you.
Very powerful point. Ms. Erickson?
I think everyone's had really important suggestions. One thing that I would like to mention in addition to support for community banks is that, again, the single most important thing we need to do for access to capital, from my perspective, is avoid repeating the next financial disaster that will seize all credit. The chairman mentioned that before I came to the Center for American Progress as the economic advisor to Scotland's First Minister, which is a tiny country with huge banks. And so I had, unfortunately, far too close a ringside seat to what happens when credit pretty much dries up overnight, when institutions that are hundreds of years old and operate in many countries pretty much go away or have to be taken over by the government. And I think that as important as Dodd-Frank is, and certainly appreciate the leadership of this committee in getting it through, if we were to go ask men and women on the street, do you think that the financial sector is safe? Do you feel like your 401k is all right? Do you trust your banks? I don't think that most people in America think that the job is done. I don't think most people in this room would think that the job is done. And so I think one of the most important things now to protect credit and access to capital is making sure that the regulations that were so strongly fought for in this chamber are actually put into place.
I think that's a very, very good point, Ms. Erickson. I think Americans get this. I think people all around the country get this. They understand that we have some very large financial institutions that are continuing to load up on risks and that it poses a danger to the entire economy. The 5 largest financial institutions, which we were told back in 2008 were too big to fail, had to be bailed out, are now 38% larger than they were when they were bailed out in 2008 and 2009. This is not a sustainable path for the United States. So I thank you very much, because I think you've made powerful points around this. Going back to Mr. Dietz's point, finance is important for being able to develop manufacturing, to develop markets, to develop all of our business activities, and getting it right so that our community banks, our credit unions, the people who are on the ground and working with small businesses can make an important difference. But we've got to make sure we don't crash this economy, let the largest financial institutions crash this economy again. I thank you all very much on this and appreciate this, Mr. Chairman.